Imagine feeding your family when sugar is rationed to half a cup per week, meat is scarce, and butter is like gold. During World War II, American families turned creativity into survival in their kitchens. Today, we're honoring those incredible home front heroes who kept families fed against impossible odds. Starting with Victory Garden Soup, a dish that turned backyard vegetables into gourmet meals. And wait until you see number 18, it's actually making a comeback in high-end restaurants today. Let's dive into the most ingenious wartime meals that kept America strong. Victory Garden Soup. In 1942, when America's food supply tightened, Victory Gardens became the nation's secret weapon. The Department of Agriculture launched a campaign that transformed 40 million backyards into mini farms, producing 40% of America's vegetables within a year. Victory Garden Soup emerged as the clever solution to use everything these gardens grew. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson's Garden Soup Station in Detroit showed how one recipe could feed an entire community. Every Saturday, neighbors brought their harvested vegetables, creating soups that people traded meat rations to get. Her breakthrough? A sandbox storage system that kept vegetables fresh all winter, feeding 75 families through the coldest months. Today, this wartime innovation is finding new life. Portland's top restaurants serve Heritage Victory Garden Soup for $14 a bowl, while food banks nationwide use the recipe to feed families for $2 per meal. Speaking of amazing transformations, wait until you hear about Lord Walton Pie. When this British recipe crossed the Atlantic in 1941, nobody guessed it would revolutionize American factory cafeterias. Lord Walton Pie. When Lord Walton became Britain's food minister in 1940, he probably never guessed his name would become famous in American kitchens. The Walton Pie crossed the Atlantic in 1941 through a strange twist of fate when Mrs. Dorothy Taylor from Boston read about it in a newspaper and shared it at her factory cafeteria. The workers loved it so much they nicknamed it the pie that powers victory. This wasn't just any vegetable pie, it was a science experiment in nutrition. The recipe called for diced potatoes, cauliflower, carrots, and turnips, topped with a crust made from potato and oatmeal instead of precious wheat flour. The New York Times reported in 1942 that factories using this recipe in their lunchrooms saw worker energy levels stay strong through afternoon shifts. The real breakthrough came from the Bethlehem steel plant in Pennsylvania. They added this pie to their cafeteria menu and tracked a 20% drop in worker fatigue. Word spread fast through other factories. By 1943, the recipe had spread to 47 states, with each region adding its own twist. Some clever cooks in Detroit added ground nuts to the crust for extra protein. And here's something amazing. This forgotten recipe is making a huge comeback. The historic royal palaces in London just added it to their cafe menu at $14 a slice. Even more surprising, 3 upscale restaurants in New York have brought it back, calling it Heritage Vegetable Pie and charging $22 a plate. Carrot hot dogs. Speaking of amazing vegetable tricks, let me tell you about carrot hot dogs, the most surprising meat substitute of the war. In 1943, when hot dogs became scarce, the school lunch program in Chicago faced a crisis. That's until cafeteria supervisor Helen Mitchell came up with something genius. She discovered that marinating thick carrots in broth and spices made them taste surprisingly like hot dogs. The best part? Kids actually preferred them to real hot dogs. The Chicago School District reported that students were trading their meat sandwiches for these carrot dogs. Parents started calling them victory dogs, and soon they were showing up at baseball games and picnics across the country. The Department of Agriculture loved this idea so much they featured it in their 1944 Victory Food Guide. The recipe spread to school districts in 18 states. Some smart mums figured out that smoking the carrots over applewood made them taste even more like the real thing. Now, speaking of clever food tricks, wait until you hear about Garden Patch Casserole. This dish was so good at hiding vegetables, kids thought they were eating an Italian restaurant meal. But the real genius part? It helped solve one of the biggest storage problems of the war. Garden Patch Casserole. Talk about neighborhood teamwork. Garden Patch Casserole turned entire streets into food storage networks in 1943. The story starts in Wilmington, Delaware, where 5 families on Cedar Street cracked the code for winter food storage. They transformed an old ice house into what they called a victory vault, using sand and wooden crates to keep vegetables fresh for months. The magic wasn't just in storing food, it was how they shared it. Each family grew different vegetables, and every Sunday they'd gather to make massive batches of this casserole. The Wilmington News Journal wrote about their system in October 1943. One family grew tomatoes, another raised onions, someone else had carrots. By working together, they cut their grocery bills by 60%. Here's the clever part that made this casserole special. Layers. First went the tomatoes, they helped keep everything moist. Then whatever vegetables were available, all topped with breadcrumbs saved from stale bread. One casserole could feed 15 people and cost just 6 cents per serving. The Department of Agriculture actually sent representatives to study their system and wrote about it in their 1944 Community Canning Guide. Root vegetable hash. Here's a breakfast that powered America's shipyards and aircraft factories. Root vegetable hash became famous in 1944 when the Kaiser shipyard in Richmond, California reported record-breaking production numbers. Their secret? A breakfast program serving this energy-packed hash to 20,000 workers daily. The recipe spread through defense plants like wildfire. The War Production Board's nutrition team found that workers who ate this hash stayed energized 2 hours longer than those who ate regular breakfasts. What made it work? They shredded potatoes, carrots, turnips, and beets together, each bringing different vitamins and minerals that kept energy levels steady. But the real breakthrough came from the storage method. Mrs. Ruth Bennett, the head cook at Kaiser, discovered that layering root vegetables between newspapers in a cool, dark place kept them fresh for up to 6 months. Her storage technique was so successful that the government printed it on recipe cards and distributed them nationwide. The hash wasn't just filling, it was practical. Workers could carry it cold in their lunch pails and it still tasted good. One worker told the Richmond Daily Register, "This hash keeps me going through double shifts. I couldn't build these ships without it." Now, speaking of stretching ingredients, wait until you hear about extended meatloaf. When meat rationing hit its peak in 1943, someone discovered a trick that turned 1 pound of meat into enough meatloaf to feed 20 people. Extended meatloaf. Here's a dish that fooled even the pickiest eaters in 1943. Extended meatloaf got its name because it could stretch 1 pound of ground meat to feed 3 times more people than usual. The secret? Quick cooking oats. But not just any oats. The Quaker Oats Company developed a special recipe that appeared in their wartime pamphlet, Stretching Meat in Wartime, which reached 8 million American homes. The genius part came from Mrs. Margaret Wilson in Detroit. She discovered that soaking the oats in leftover coffee before mixing them with meat made the meatloaf look and taste just like it was made with all meat. Her recipe won the Michigan State Fair's Patriotic Cooking Contest in 1944, beating out 167 other entries. The judges couldn't believe it contained only 6 ounces of meat. Spam and potato bake. When Spam hit grocery shelves in 1937, nobody guessed it would become America's secret weapon. By 1944, Hormel was producing 15 million cans of Spam every week, with nearly 70% heading to troops overseas. But the home front turned those precious few civilian cans into miracles. The Spam and potato bake became famous in Austin, Minnesota, Hormel's hometown. Local factory workers' wives figured out that 1 can of Spam, thinly sliced and layered with potatoes, could feed an entire potluck. The local paper, the Austin Daily Herald, reported in 1944 that neighborhood potlucks were serving up to 50 people using just 3 cans of Spam mixed with homegrown potatoes. Now, wait until you hear about Navy Bean Power Plate, the dish that changed how Americans thought about protein forever. Navy Bean Power Plate. When meat became scarce in 1943, a discovery at the University of Michigan changed everything. Researchers found that navy beans packed more protein per penny than any other food available. The Office of War Information jumped on this finding and launched what they called the Great Bean Campaign. A pound of navy beans costing just 8 cents could provide the same protein as a pound of meat that cost 45 cents. The Boston school system became the testing ground for what would revolutionize school lunches across America. They created the Power Plate, navy beans cooked with a tiny piece of salt pork and served over cornbread. The results amazed everyone. School nurses reported that children eating the bean plate had more energy than those eating meat lunches. By 1944, over 6,000 school cafeterias across the country had adopted this meal. Think beans are expensive today? That same plate would cost about $1.20 to make now, still 1/5 the cost of a meat-based lunch. No wonder food banks nationwide are bringing back this recipe to help families stretch their budgets. For mock chicken patties. Just when you think you've heard it all, wait until you hear about mock chicken patties. This might be the greatest food trick of World War II. In 1944, the Palmer House Hotel in Chicago stunned everyone by winning the Best Chicken Dish competition without using a single piece of chicken. The head cook, Mrs. Florence Henderson, created these patties using a mix of ground pork scraps, crushed crackers, and a secret blend of poultry seasoning. The judges couldn't tell the difference. When the truth came out, instead of disqualifying her, they created a new category called Creative Wartime Solutions and awarded her first prize. The real kicker? These patties used meat that cost half as much as chicken, but tasted so authentic that 25 other Chicago restaurants started serving them. The Chicago Tribune reported that customers would specifically request those special chicken patties, never knowing they weren't eating chicken at all. Speaking of amazing substitutions, wait until you hear about Soybean Surprise. When this dish showed up at a White House dinner in 1943, guests thought they were eating imported delicacies, but the truth was even more fascinating. Soybean Surprise. Here's a dish that fooled even the fanciest dinner guests in Washington, D.C. In 1943, Eleanor Roosevelt served what guests thought was an exotic Asian delicacy at a White House dinner. Their jaws dropped when she revealed it was Soybean Surprise, made from crops grown right in American soil. The Department of Agriculture had just launched their Soy for Victory campaign, teaching farmers to grow this protein-packed crop. Henry Ford himself jumped on board, turning his demonstration farm in Dearborn into a soy testing ground. By 1944, American farmers were growing 100 times more soybeans than they had in 1940. The government's research labs made an amazing discovery. Soybeans contained all 8 essential proteins found in meat. A single cup of cooked soybeans provided the same protein as half a pound of beef at just 1/3 the cost. The War Food Administration printed 2 million recipe booklets showing homemakers how to cook these miracle beans. But the real magic happened in school cafeterias. When the Chicago school system started serving Soybean Surprise in 1944, they found kids actually preferred it to regular meat dishes. The secret? They seasoned it with herbs grown in school victory gardens, making each batch taste like a home-cooked meal. Tomato soup cake. Just when you think wartime cooks couldn't get more creative, along comes a cake that uses soup instead of eggs and milk. Tomato soup cake became the talk of every birthday party in 1944, not because anyone could taste the soup, but because nobody could. The Campbell's Soup Company reported their tomato soup sales doubled after this recipe spread through women's magazines. Here's the genius part. The soup's acidity helped the cake rise perfectly without eggs, while its natural sweetness cut down on precious sugar rations. The Massachusetts Extension Service tested the recipe and found it saved families 12 ration points compared to regular cake recipes. One mother in Springfield became locally famous for trading her secret mystery cake recipe for extra ration stamps, until someone spotted the Campbell's cans in her trash. Would you believe this cake is going viral on TikTok right now? Food bloggers are calling it Depression-era red velvet. Modern bakers love it because a cake that costs less than $3 to make tastes just like one from a fancy bakery. Speaking of sweet solutions, wait until you hear about rice and raisin pudding. When sugar rations hit their lowest point in 1945, one clever cook discovered that boiled rice water could turn a handful of raisins into what tasted like pounds of sugar. Rice and raisin pudding. When sugar rations dropped to just 12 ounces per person per month in 1944, one Chicago school cook made a discovery that changed dessert forever. She found that cooking rice in water twice created a naturally sweet liquid that could make raisins taste sweeter than candy. The Chicago Board of Education tested her recipe and found it used 75% less sugar than traditional puddings. The genius part? She taught other school cooks to save the rice cooking water instead of throwing it away. Soon, this pudding showed up at every school celebration in the Midwest. The War Food Administration featured it in their 1944 Sugar Saving Solutions Guide, noting that 1 cup of raisins and 2 cups of rice could make dessert for 24 children. Before long, it became the star at community events. The Ladies' Home Journal reported that in December 1944, one small town in Iowa served this pudding to 200 people at their Victory Christmas celebration, using just 1 pound of sugar. Speaking of stretching ingredients to feed a crowd, wait until you hear about Cornmeal Scrapple. Some factory workers swore it kept them going better than eggs and bacon. Cornmeal Scrapple. Pennsylvania Dutch families had been making scrapple for generations, but in 1943, they shared their secret with the nation. When pork prices soared to 45 cents per pound, this recipe that used just a handful of meat scraps to flavor an entire pan of cornmeal became a nationwide sensation. The real breakthrough happened at the Bethlehem steel plant. Workers eating cornmeal scrapple for breakfast could work 2 hours longer than those eating regular breakfasts. The company's health department found that the combination of cornmeal and tiny bits of meat provided steady energy all morning long. By 1944, 20 other steel plants had added it to their cafeteria menus. The Wall Street Journal even wrote about this breakfast revolution, reporting that American factories saved over $2 million in 1944 by switching to cornmeal scrapple from traditional breakfasts. One slice, costing just 3 cents, packed the same energy as an egg and bacon breakfast that cost 15 cents. Now get ready for something that'll blow your mind. Wartime Mac and Cheese. When dairy products became scarce, someone discovered a trick with powdered milk, made this comfort food even better than the original Wartime Mac and Cheese. Here's where powdered milk became a wartime hero. In 1943, the government started shipping tons of powdered milk to England, leaving American families scrambling for alternatives. That's when Mrs. Ruth Peterson, a school cook in Minneapolis, discovered something amazing. Powdered milk made mac and cheese creamier than fresh milk ever did. The Department of Agriculture tested her recipe and found it saved 40% on dairy rations while providing more calcium than the original. By 1944, her Miracle Mac recipe had spread to 1,200 school cafeterias nationwide. The best part? It cost just 7 cents per serving to make, compared to 18 cents for regular mac and cheese. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune reported that kids were trading their home-packed lunches for this school version. One mother wrote to the paper asking, "What's your secret? My children won't eat my macaroni and cheese anymore." That secret recipe ended up feeding over 2 million schoolchildren during the war years. Speaking of amazing transformations, wait until you hear about Victory Bread Pudding. This dish turned yesterday's stale bread into something so special, it became a Sunday tradition. Victory Bread Pudding. Victory Bread Pudding proved that nothing had to go to waste during wartime. The Women's Land Army reported in 1944 that this single recipe saved over 200,000 pounds of bread from being thrown away in New York City alone. The secret? Turning stale bread into a dessert so good people forgot it started as leftovers. Every Sunday, neighborhoods would pool their week's worth of stale bread for community dessert gatherings. The New York Times featured a story about the Pudding Brigade, 5 Brooklyn blocks that turned their combined bread scraps into dessert for 150 people each week. They even saved the breadcrumbs to make toppings. Today, this zero-waste champion is making waves again. Popular chef Jamie Oliver recently featured a modern version on his show, calling it the original zero-waste dessert. Food waste programs across America are bringing back this recipe, proving that good ideas never go stale. Now you won't believe what's coming up next: mock apple pie. Here's the most incredible food trick of 1944. When apples hit a shocking 50 cents per pound, Nabisco shared a recipe that changed everything: mock apple pie made with crushed Ritz crackers. The Chicago Daily Tribune reported people standing in line for hours just to buy crackers after the recipe appeared in their paper. Mrs. Helen Marshall from Ohio took this recipe to the State Fair's apple pie contest. The judges awarded her first prize, then nearly fainted when she revealed there wasn't a single apple in her pie. The local paper's headline read, "Cracker pie beats real apples." Her secret? Boiling the crackers with lemon juice and cinnamon created the same texture and taste as cooked apples. The recipe spread so fast that Nabisco had to triple their cracker production. At 15 cents a box, these crackers could make 2 pies that would have cost $2 each using real apples. Today, food history buffs on YouTube have recreated this recipe over 2 million times, proving that clever cooking never goes out of style. Speaking of amazing substitutions, wait until you hear about potato coffee cake. When real coffee became a luxury, this morning treat kept factory workers going strong. Potato coffee cake. In 1943, Detroit's auto plants faced a crisis. With coffee strictly rationed, workers were falling asleep on assembly lines. Then someone discovered that roasted ground potatoes mixed with a tiny bit of real coffee could stretch 1 pound of coffee into 5. The Detroit Free Press called it the wake-up wonder of 1943. The numbers told the amazing story. Ford Motor Company reported a 23% productivity boost after introducing this coffee cake in their morning shift breaks. Workers loved it because it looked and tasted like real coffee cake, thanks to the natural sugars in potatoes that caramelized during baking. But here's the really clever part: mixing grated potato into the cake batter made it stay fresh for days. The War Production Board actually studied this recipe and distributed it to 500 other factories nationwide. Their records show it saved these plants over 100,000 pounds of coffee and 50,000 pounds of sugar in just 1 year. Now get ready for something that'll surprise you even more: Eggless Wonder Cake. When eggs disappeared from stores in 1944, someone discovered a replacement that worked even better: Eggless Wonder Cake. When eggs hit 70 cents a dozen in 1944, a Boston chemistry teacher turned kitchen scientist. She discovered that mixing vinegar with baking soda created tiny air bubbles that made cakes rise better than eggs ever did. The Boston Globe featured her recipe after it saved 50 wedding celebrations in 1 month alone. What made this cake special? It used zero rationed ingredients but tasted richer than fancy bakery cakes. Word spread so fast that the Office of Price Administration printed the recipe on the back of ration books. Their records show it saved families an average of 15 ration points per celebration. This cake is having a huge moment right now. Vegan bakeries across America are selling it for $8 a slice, marketing it as the original vegan cake. One New York bakery reported making $50,000 last year just from this wartime recipe. Hard to believe something born from shortages would become a modern luxury. Speaking of luxury foods turned upside down, wait until you hear about mock oyster stew. This dish fooled even the fanciest church suppers in New England. Mock oyster stew. In 1943, when oysters cost $2 per pint, someone rediscovered an old vegetable that would change church suppers forever. Salsify, a root vegetable nicknamed the oyster plant, tasted so much like real oysters that it fooled a group of food critics at Boston's Parker House Hotel. The Catholic Diocese of Boston spread the recipe through their parish network after one church saved $300 on their Friday dinner budget. Sliced thin and cooked in milk, Salsify created the same creamy, rich stew that usually required expensive oysters. The church cookbook, Faithful Feeding in Hard Times, sold 50,000 copies because of this one recipe. Here's the amazing part. Victory gardeners could grow Salsify for just pennies. One root, costing 2 cents to grow, could replace $1 worth of oysters. The Department of Agriculture's Victory Garden Guide added Salsify to their must-grow list after this discovery. These wartime recipes did more than just feed families. They helped win the war. American factory workers built 297,000 aircraft, 102,000 tanks, and 88,000 warships, all powered by these creative meals. That's the real power of these recipes. They kept America's workforce strong when it mattered most. These aren't just old recipes, they're survival lessons wrapped in flavor. From Victory Garden soup to community victory cake, each dish proves that working together beats going it alone. If you've got a family recipe that helped your relatives through tough times, share it in the comments below. And don't miss next week's video about the most incredible money-saving tricks from 1950s diners. Hit that subscribe button and notification bell to join our journey through history's most amazing food stories. Remember to drop a like if you learned something new today, because sometimes the best solutions to today's problems come from yesterday's wisdom.